All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so I've gotten a lot of requests here, and I'm going to respond to those requests and try to be as flexible as possible. So here's what we're going to do today. I am going to do a crash course, and I mean an absolute crash course in administrative law, okay? This is for the NCA exams, for anybody who's watching on YouTube or who sees this later. This is a crash course on the NCA, Canadian Administrative Law, okay? Now, please understand, guys, this is not a substitute for doing your reading at home, doing your own homework, making sure that you've got the cases, first and foremost, read, second of all, noted up, third, that you understand what the cases mean. All I'm trying to do, guys, is give you, to coin a law school phrase, essentially an attack outline, okay? Now, the way that I view, and please understand, I've said this before and I'm going to say it 100 more times, my way isn't the best way, it's just the way that seems to work. It's worked for some of my students, a lot of my students, it's worked for myself, it's you know, my brother and I went through the NCAs like I've told you guys before. So this is the methodology that I use. This is the way that I think about Canadian administrative law that seems to work and seems to help a lot of my students. So here's what we're going to do, guys. We're going to break this down, and we're really going to attack the very bare bones, just outline even what the skeletal structure of this this course looks like. Okay. Now, again, folks, not a substitute for your own reading, not a substitute for doing the work, putting in the time. The way that I view administrative law is actually in three parts. It's not like your traditional law school sort of course, okay, guys? It's one of those situations where it's a whole process. Remember what administrative law is meant to do. It's meant to ease the workload from the courts. So the first thing that we need to wonder, the first question that we have to ask, guys, is number one, okay? Do we owe this person procedural fairness? All right, let's say we've got Tim here. All right, Tim, I'm not trying to pick on you. Okay, Tim is appearing in front of a tribunal. Let's say he, I don't know, landlord-tenant board. Okay, great version of a tribunal. Okay, these guys have been in business for, I don't know, 100 years or more, probably even more. But the first question that they have to ask is Tim owed procedural fairness? Okay? Now, what does that mean in English? What does that mean? Forget the legalese, forget the jargon for a second. What does that mean in plain English? Do we even care about Tim? Is Tim going to be the end-all be-all? Do we have to treat this guy fairly? Or can we just say, Tim, I don't like your t-shirt, I don't like your tie, I don't like your sweater, I don't like the shoes that you're wearing, so get out of my office. Forget it. It's not going to happen here. Okay? Well, generally speaking, some level of procedural fairness is owed. We're going to get into how much in a second here, but the first question that we have to ask is this. Is procedural fairness even owed? Okay? Now, in other words, do we have to treat this person fairly? The person who's in front of the tribunal. Do we care about this person? Now, the way that we answer this question, now, trust me, there are a lot of cases that went into this. Okay, there are a lot. But the way that we answer this is, guess what? Drum roll, please. It's by way of the Knight factors. The Knight factors. Okay. Remember, the Knight case is one of the seminal cases in administrative law. It is one of the landmark cases in administrative law, and if you haven't read this case, you need to, right away, you need to know this case, you need to know it inside out and backwards and sideways. But I'll break it down for you. The Knight factors came up with a determination, or the way in which we can figure out whether or not this person, and in our case, Tim over here, is even owed procedural fairness. Do we even care about Tim? Do we have to treat him fairly? Now, the first question that we ask under the Knight factors is A, what is the nature of the decision? Okay? What is the nature of this decision? Is this a final decision or an interim decision? Now, I'll break that down for you. If a final decision is being made, in other words, going back to our example, we've got Tim here who's facing the landlord-tenant tribunal. Okay, he's getting evicted. The question is this going to be a final decision, as in, are we booting him out and kick him out and throw him on his butt out to the streets? Or is this an interim decision? Is this a temporary decision based on some other intervening event? In other words, are we only making a temporary decision awaiting a final decision of some kind? Okay? Interim meaning temporary, guys, okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put underneath here, temporary. All right, temporary. Hopefully you guys can see that on the recording. Hopefully you guys can read my handwriting. I know. Look, I am certainly not a calligrapher. My handwriting is pretty terrible. But let's go over this again. The first segment, the first chapter, I like to call it, that's why it's a big Roman numeral number 1, is the question, do we owe this person procedural fairness? And how do we answer this question? Well, under the procedural fairness question, we have the night factors. The first night factor is number A. Well, A, whatever, I'm not too sure how they do that in sign language, but letter A. What is the nature of this decision? Is this a final decision? Is this an interim decision? The other thing that comes into play every once in a while is, well, what it used to be, is this an administrative decision or legislative? Now, folks, I'm not going to go too far into the difference here between administrative and legislative, simply because that's really not much of a question anymore. The courts have sort of done away with that. They've sort of moved away from this distinction between administrative and legislative. Why? Because there really is no clear-cut delineation. It's a little hard to tell. The lines are fuzzy. Administrative is really quasi-legislative, and legislative is quasi-administrative. So bear with me. It's sort of a secondary category. The real question that we're asking is this one. Is this a final decision or an interim decision? Okay? Let's talk about what this means in terms of the night factor. The first night factor, the night factor number A. If this is a final decision, all right? If this is a final decision, guys, do you think we're going to owe him more or less procedural fairness? Do you think we're actually going to need to treat Tim fairly if this is only temporary? All right, let's take a poll here. How many of you guys think that if this is a temporary decision, okay, if this is just a temporary decision, we need to treat him fairly? Okay, some of you guys. Others, you guys believe that if this is a final decision, it's more likely than not we're going to need to treat Tim fairly, right? Okay, well, I can tell you the latter half, the second choice is actually the right one. And why is that? Okay, let's take this carefully, guys, and please bear in mind this is a crash course, so I'm trying to be as detailed as possible, but also as general as possible. I know, it just blows your mind in terms of what I'm actually trying to convey here. But let me try and break this down. The more final the decision, the more likely it is we're going to need to treat this individual, in our case Tim, fairly. Why? Because if it's a final decision, what remedy does he have? Not a lot, right? If Tim is about to be kicked out on his butt into the streets by the landlord-tenant board, if he's going to get evicted, there's not much that he can do, aside from finding a new apartment or filing an actual lawsuit. Now, what happens if this is just a temporary decision? If this is just a temporary decision, let's say, for instance, do we prevent Tim from getting access to his parking space while the apartment building upgrades the ventilation in the parking lot? Well, That's just a temporary decision. Okay? What's his remedy? Well, he parks somewhere else. He's not going to be incredibly harmed by this. If it's a final decision, it's more likely than not that he's going to have some significant damage in some way, shape, or form. Look, I don't like apartment shopping any more than anybody else, but the reality is, if Tim's out, right? Tim, you gotta go find another apartment, man. Kind of sucks. I mean, realistically, you gotta go back to what is that website, Rent.com, or I don't know, some other website that you gotta find an apartment. You have to go look and you have to negotiate a lease. That's a problem. Okay, so really, we need to ask ourselves, what is the nature of the decision? Is it a final decision? Is it an interim decision? The more final it is, the more likely it is we're going to need to treat him fairly. Okay? Now, the next question that we're going to ask, under the night factors,